real digital humans.
Hi, this is Stefan Albert with the Real Digital Humans podcast. Today, very excited to introduce Dr. Naim Zierau. He's a researcher at the University of St.Gallen. Actually did his PhD there on conversational interfaces and is now continuing on his research. One of those research projects is actually together with me and Aisha, where we're actually researching what are the benefits of shifting from, let's say, a chatbot or even a voice bot to a digital human, and how can we further improve those benefits? So given you've done a lot of research on this, Naim, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, I'm super excited to have you on the show. And I'm just going to kick it over to you just for a bit more of a broad introduction, and particularly what excites you so much around chatbots and conversational interfaces that you've devoted, half a decade already to this topic.
Thank you, Stefan, for the invitation to your podcast. Yes, I'm a researcher at the University of St.Gallen, and I broadly focus on the application of conversational interfaces, meaning all interfaces that speak to you via natural language. And I focus particularly on the application in customer service operations. And in my PhD, I did really research on, for instance, how you can use voice bots in service operations, what are the benefits against maybe text-based interfaces, and also how to better design conversational interface experiences so that customers find delight in interacting with these interfaces, which was one big part of my research. And now the past year, I've been working with a number of companies in Switzerland on understanding how can we actually efficiently implement these interfaces in the contact center, also focusing on the managing part of it. Like, what do we need to change in terms of operations, in terms of the way we measure success, in terms of what are the best use cases to use these interfaces for. So that has been also a big research or part of my research in the past years.
Yeah, it's a super exciting space. Of course, it's blown up in the last 6 months with ChatGPT, and now everybody wants to participate. Even companies that would have never thought that they wanted to. We've moved past the world, which I remember 6 months ago. That's a long time ago. Where if you said you're doing something or you mentioned the word chatbot, people just go, "Oh, I hate those things. I always press cancel or speak to agent." But now people are spending their spare time conversing with conversational AI. So we've clearly gone past a hurdle, and it's changing perceptions. I'm assuming that you've felt some of this in your work, working with different corporates and organizations in Switzerland.
I think one part of it was probably also the introduction of ChatGPT. I think people realized that interacting with a computer face via natural language can be very efficient, seamless, can be very intuitive. I think that was maybe one of the things that we learned through the introduction of ChatGPT. I think even before, I think there are studies that show that there are experiences where people are actually not aware anymore that they talk to a computer rather than a human, because the computer is so good in emulating a human being in his conversation, the capabilities, that actually people in some instances don't realize that they talk to a human employee. And I think that's what I'm also seeing now working with these companies, is that there is actually real value. We can see that people improve efficiency, that they can save time, that companies can save money. So there are real advantages of using these bots in customer service operations. I think that's something that has been clearly shown now in the last 3 years, with the companies I'm working now with.
I think it's really interesting. You've mentioned a few things like save time, etc. One thing I've noticed with chatbots and digital humans is this sort of nirvana fallacy argument, saying, we don't want to speak to a chatbot or a digital human. We want to speak to the real person. Obviously, yeah. But of course, in real life, they don't get that real person. They don't get that real person 24/7 when they want. So,
Yeah.
if you have, let's say, an application with a digital human that's
Yeah.
helping you lose weight, reminding you multiple times a day, and you can ask it questions, it gives you helpful tips, just as a silly example. You get a lot of the benefits of having a real human 24/7. What's the alternative? The alternative isn't having a dietitian and a sports therapist sitting next to you 24/7, just waiting to answer a question. That is not realistic. So there's this nirvana fallacy that it needs to be as good or better than a real human and 24/7 available. And in fact, what drives value is being better than what people would currently do today, which is often get no support, get very limited support, spend half an hour waiting on a telephone to get,
Yeah.
to get a response at all, to Google something. So what are all of these things which are so much better than how we spend our time today?
And I would also add something. We're now talking about maybe extending human-like services beyond service hours. But I think maybe even a second, and that's also a very compelling story, is that there are a lot of digitized customer interactions that we can actually make much better and much more enjoyable when we use a conversational interface or a conversational agent.
Yeah.
Because like filling out like a boring online form, I don't know if that actually leads to customer delight, but using maybe a chatbot to do that can be much, much more fun for the customer, and even simplify it, because we humans are wired to to conversation, to talking, to conversational dialogue. And if we can, and I think that obviously that we need to deeply think about how to design these dialogues, that they make sense to the customer. But if we are successful in that, we can show customers or give customers a much better customer experience than just going to a web page that is static, that is maybe boring. And and I think that's one key benefit also of these conversational interfaces, that we can improve our existing digital experience.
Now, I think this is fascinating, obviously. If we think of the first step, will people talk to a computer? They know it's a computer in most cases, and I think they should always know that they're talking to it. But they're speaking to a computer, the iPhone, and they know it's a computer, and they start having a conversation. Now, either people will think that they're crazy, or they'll think they're crazy, or we as humans somehow find that acceptable.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of research on this, so maybe, as part of that research, part of your PhD research to begin with, what were your key findings around why people will interact with a computer in the first place and not think they're crazy?
One part of my work, my early work, was actually summarizing and synthesizing research findings across different disciplines. And I think this research gave some promising kind of avenues to look at. And I think one thing is basically like the ability of these machines to seem like a human being, even like give it a sense of human touch. And I think that's just what people really, really enjoy. We are social beings, and then interacting with a software that is not a human, but that maybe look like a human or look more like a human and act like a human, is something that we just enjoy. It is something we are wired to like. And I think that's really, really a big part of it. I mean, there is this tendency of anthropomorphization, which that people actually give um, objects or animals human names, because that's something they enjoy. They enjoy giving something names to make it human. And so I think this is one big thing. And then I think the second mechanism that we need to look at is also that language can be much, much more efficient. So if I can tell a machine I want this, and then it gives me that in seconds, versus I have to look through the web page to find this kind of information. I think this is the second one, when people will actually accept conversational agents. And so I think it's on the one side this very pragmatic kind of values, like it
Mm-hmm.
makes it more efficient, it makes it more tangible, and the second being it is more fun because it gives us a human touch, and I think that's also what I could emulate in my own experiments. I could show
Mm-hmm.
that people are more trusting, that they through these agents then rather than a web page, if they, for instance, provide credit information to a computer, or I could show like one large chunk of my work was also comparing text-based interfaces and voice-based interfaces, and voice is arguably even more human than just writing. And here we could show the same, that people felt that this is like a very that this is a very natural and intuitive way to interact, and it has this more human touch. And I think, just summarizing again, I think it's both functional value, efficiency gains, and the second, like emotional value,
Yeah.
being having like a sense of human touch, and yeah.
And then I think there's a third piece, and I read this great paper from a guy called Naim Zierau, and one of the things that it was highlighting, which I really liked, is the experience of flow and how
Yes.
critical flow is. Now, flow is not necessarily linked to the other person, it's not necessarily linked to a
Mm.
pragmatic thing. It's also how people feel themselves when they're in a conversation versus, when they're, let's say, typing something, and it changes the way they think, changes the way they make decisions. Could you tell me a little bit more about how people change when they're in a flow state versus a non-flow state?
I mean, so flow is basically like the state of immersion. You feel that you feel like you lose the time around you. It's effortless, and there is a lot of research that shows that flow states can have beneficial customer behaviors. That people are much more akin to experiment, to maybe even buy something, and because flow is just, it seems to be like this mechanism that somehow reassures people that that it's okay. And I think what I've been showing, and this was basically also this research of voice-based systems versus more text-based systems, is that this state of talking is something that immerses us into like into a conversational state, and
Mm-hmm.
conversational states really help us to focus on the interaction at hand, to I mean, if we are in a voice-based conversation, we need to listen to what the interface tells us, and we need to respond directly. It's a much different experience when we were talking, because when we were writing, because when we're writing, we can like look around, we can leave the conversation, but this, like just speaking to a machine, forces us to be present in the moment and to focus on the conversations. I think that was one big mechanism, and the second also, that voice and talking is much more natural and intuitive to humans than writing. Writing is much more associated with with cognitive strain, and it can be much harder than just just talking. I think that also shows, if I talk to our firm partners, is that people really like to just pick up the telephone and call their customer service employee. And I think one key benefit of voice-based interactions, and maybe even of conversation and interactions at large, I think chatting is probably, if you chat, we have like the same kind of experiences, that it is increasing like a state of flow for customers, which comes with all these positive benefits that companies can reap.
So if I dumb it down a little bit, you could
Yeah.
say that if you're, let's say, filling in a form on a web page and
Yes.
going through data, you can do lots of data much easier than you can in a spoken way. You can scan lots of information. You can even type quite a lot of information and
Yeah.
respond to lots of questions super quickly. So you can do high volumes of data, but at a very shallow connection,
Yes.
and completely driven by the head, and sort of analytical. But if you're in a flow-like state, so if you're having a voice conversation or a video conversation even more, you are much more connected. So you have a much deeper emotional connection. It's more intimate in some ways, but it also forces you to focus on less things. So, you can only focus on the word counts, let's say in the words, the information that is shared through the words, you can only focus on a much smaller amount, but you get all of these emotional elements, and your brain has the time to absorb it, maybe in an emotional way. So it's either less information, but much deeper and much more, much broader in the type of information that's collected, or text, which is lots of data, but at the same time, not such a deep connection. Would that be a fair summary?
I mean, you're asking now a researcher, and a researcher would say it depends. And I think, but what you're, I think what you're alluring to is, that I think was something we could also show in the paper, is that because yes, voice is not a good medium to transport a lot of data or a lot of information. And what we could show is that if you use a voice-based interface, you need to carefully think about the conversational logic you employ, because people are sensitive to information overload, especially in voice-based exchanges. And also, if you think about voice-based exchanges, it needs to have like a very logical flow that fits like what a real conversation would be like. And I think probably text is much more forgiving in that way. But I would also, and I would add on this, like, we didn't show this in the paper, but I would argue that we would see a similar mechanism if we, for instance, compare a simple online form and a conversational text-based form. I would also think that we see there much more flow, or like much more immersiveness, because it's much more synchronous, and it is a back and forth. And I think this back and forth, like this turn-taking kind of mechanism, and there is actually a researcher here at the University of St.Gallen that also just published a paper on this mechanism of turn-taking, just like this back and forth, that this is so beneficial because it creates this, what I was referring to earlier, this, what you also were saying, this emotional value, like this sense of human touch and social presence. This is what we call it in science, called social presence, which is just translated into like this sense of human touch. So yeah, I hope that somehow answers your question.
Yeah, I find it a super fascinating space. Why it works, how it works, and what are the mechanisms to make it work even better. And I think that's one of the things you focus on your paper. But let's now fast forward to the last 6 months. So since you did your PhD, you've also taken that same approach where you said, okay, what happens in, let's say an online form versus a chatbot versus a voice bot. And then, together with Swiss and Aisha, we were then looking at what happens if you go from a voice bot or a chat bot, and then you shift to a digital human. Now, I just want to share one thing that struck me already on the research that you and the team did, is that you look at the collected papers, and I think there was like around 50 of them, plus or minus, and the majority of them were written, I think, around 2020 to 2023, like super recent.
Yeah.
Even more, I don't have the exact numbers, but it seems like this is just an area, this sort of research on the power of having a human face. There's a few sporadic documents going back in like over 30, 40 years. In the last 10 years, there's just been quite a few handfuls of documents, and then it's just exploded in the last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was also in earlier times there was research, or like there were researchers that were looking, we will call this embodied systems. These could be either robots, or they were actually focusing on on virtual representations of humans, which are very immature. Like, I mean, they didn't look like real human people.
Yeah.
They looked very artificial, but there was initial interest already quite early. But now, obviously, with opportunities to build better human experiences, meaning like using like faces that somehow look almost as if they are real human people. I mean, obviously, still, I mean, there is differences, and I mean, but obviously, if I mean the technology improves and it improves at a fast pace, this will probably be quite soon. We will have human experiences that look the way we can't, where like a layperson would not see the difference anymore between a human person and a digital human. And yeah, with this increasing capabilities now, researchers start to be interested in these experiences
Yeah.
again, and therefore also finding some really interesting benefits of using like you call it the power of the human face. And I mean the human face, I mean if we look at communication, one big chunk of communication that we use to process information is actually nonverbal communication. And I think that's one big benefit of these kind of machines, that they can use now nonverbal communication to improve understanding, to build rapport or build rapport with users. And that's those topics are researchers are starting to get interested again, with the technological advances we have been seeing for the past years.
Yeah, I mean, I only have to disagree with you on one point,
Okay.
that we have to wait until we get human-like representations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not for all conversations, not for all situations, but the number of times I've shown the digital human,
Mm-hmm.
you know, based on the newest technology that we use, a third-party technology that we use, and people say, okay, yeah, but I thought that it was a digital human. I thought that it was a fake. Obviously, this is just you talking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, no, this is my digital twin. And they're like, no, it can't be. Like, that's the response I get. Are you sure? And it's so perfect now for some of these, the highest quality ones out there, that to the naked eye, unless you know the person, unless you ask them to say something very specific and the voice and all of this doesn't come through, or you see them for a long time and you realize that they're very few, you can add micro gestures, but they're very limited, and you realize that it's like most of a real human, but there's still some magic missing. And I think but for the layperson, we're already there. That would be my only disagreement. For the layperson, we're already there.
I mean, you might be right with this. I mean, I think, I mean, yeah, it really depends. Probably also this was just my own observation of it. And I mean, obviously, when I look at digital humans, and when I look, I mean, I have this more kind of, I try to find this.
Well, you're a researcher. You're not exactly a layperson.
Things. And obviously, yes, I would agree. Probably, if you don't look for these differences, you probably don't expect them to be different, and it could be almost like a real, it could be as good as a real human experience. Yeah.
And a bit of a shout out to there's I don't know if it's a doctor, professor, researcher, Seymour, in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And he's done some exceptional work, I think. And he's tried to like very pragmatically understand where we're at in this world. And one of those papers is called "Have We Crossed the Uncanny Valley?" Where he really looks at, what does it take and how do people respond? What are your thoughts on his research there and the uncanny valley in general?
I think this is a very cool paper, and I also think, I think that was the most, like, referring to the uncanny valley. I think that was one of the most urgent things to solve with digital humans. So there's like this idea that if you have a digital human experience that is almost that if it's not that, like if it's almost human, but it's still awkwardly human, that it creates this sense of eeriness, and that people respond kind of like it's that people don't actually enjoy these kinds of experiences. If a robot looks like a human or like almost like a human, but then it doesn't move like a human, that it creates this sense of awkwardness, eeriness, and can actually be detrimental to user experience. And I think what they actually show is that new kind of systems, and I think that the latest version of digital humans somehow don't create this feeling anymore, that people actually now feel a sense of happiness and enjoyment when they interact with newer versions of digital humans. Yes.
Yeah. And I find it also interesting. He's got a great article out there, a second one that he's done, which is Face It, Users Don't Care, Affinity and Trustworthiness of Imperfect Digital Humans.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's basically referring to his own research and many others' research that said that realistic digital humans are considered more trustworthy than, let's say, stylized cartoon versions. And there's lots of conversations, and his own paper around, the eeriness factor. But he actually did a whole paper where he specifically went in and created all these imperfections of real videos and digital humans. What they found at the end of the day is people don't care. Like once you get past, you get past that eeriness curve and you're somewhere past it. Beyond that, it's all just noise, like white noise. People don't care anymore.
Yeah.
It's like if you watch a video, in 4K, that's
Yes.
nice. If you watch it in 40K, I don't think you'd even notice the difference. If you watch it in HD, actually 99% of the times, unless you have two things right next to each other, you won't even notice the difference. And I think that's a really critical piece. So, for all intents and purposes, I think from the visual piece, digital human or the avatars have crossed this boundary now. So we don't need to worry so much with those lifelike avatars, the high quality ones at least. We're there. But then it comes to the finer pieces. So how can it share specific emotions that relate to the conversation? And of course, in the back end, how can you share the right information and then pass that through with the right emotions? So I think these elements are really all coming together. We've got the ChatGPT, which is now providing really good, sensible answers, and you even just advanced chatbots where people have really put a lot of forethought can be just as good or even better because it's really specific, tested, human in the loop. But on the other side, we're getting the chatbot capable of having micro gestures. And I think it's just a little matter of time until you're actually going to be using the AI to incorporate when you should implement which micro gesture based on the emotions that the AI wants to share at that particular time. It's like, hey, I've got some great news, excitement. And then, the digital human says, oh, excitement. I need to nod and smile and share excitement somehow. And that we start integrating these, what have typically been two separate things. How do you create the answers or the text? And then how do you create the face? But actually, how can you create the text and the face with emotion sort of in a single step? And I think that's going to be coming out probably this year or next year latest, I believe. Things are moving so quickly in this space.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that echoes very much the experience I'm having working with companies. Is the technology is not really the problem. I think we have for the most part, we have the technological maturity to implement all sorts of use cases now. I think now it's really more about what kind of use cases really bring value to the customer, really bring value to the company. What kind of structures do we have to implement in our companies and organizations to like how can we integrate also like an avatar based or like a conversation interface based experience with other channels? And I think it's more these questions now that come to the forefront rather than the technology. I think there we now have the technological maturity to do all of that. But now we need to really critically think, obviously, where customers or users would want to interact with a conversational interface or with a digital human, and when does it also bring value to the firm that employs it?
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. And let's dive in a little bit to this. So you've done a bunch of research. You're heavily involved with multiple organizations across Switzerland, and you're focusing on an area that I personally haven't been looking very much in, which is more around this sort of sales customer service. So
Mm-hmm.
with you, based on your experience, especially with these advances in digital human technologies and faces that look and sound like real people, and people being able to speak now, so you have the whole speech to text is becoming better and better.
Yeah.
Where would you see what would be one or two of the most exciting use cases that you've either seen being implemented, or you believe will be the next places that digital humans will start to make a big impact?
So, I mean, what we tried to do in our research, and we did that with conversation interfaces, but we also now do that with digital humans, is to really systematically evaluate different customer touch points. To, on the one side, think about what is the savings that we can actually, like, what kind of time can we save up with real human service employees by using these kinds of interfaces on the one side. On the other side, how much customer experience benefits can we end with implementing such a use case, both being two important dimensions of using these interfaces. On the other hand, to also think about what is the ease with which we can implement them, like looking into technical ease. Obviously, those use cases where you need a lot of APIs, these are more difficult to implement, but also to look into, will users be ready to interact with these kind of systems, referring to some kind of social ease, like, because there are just some instances, especially if you're hectic or if you're stressed, where you want to have like the real human experience, or when
Yeah.
so then also thinking about regulatory ease. So we have like this 3 dimension of ease that we try to rate, like these different kinds of experiences. And looking at digital human, I mean, we're still in the middle of this research, but I think, to me, like, one very big use case is health, because in health, sometimes you don't have the luxury of seeing a human person.
Mhm.
And then, like, actually using digital humans to somehow give a bit of a human experience in some instances, for instance, in very easy interactions, like for maybe explaining like a medical condition to somebody, like something that, for instance, like diabetes, where we have so many people suffering from diabetes, and there we could start with these kinds of use cases to help. I see like a big use case to interact with with a human, real good human, digital human, that answers some basic questions on the on the disease on the one side, but also gives some, maybe even some tips and tricks to improve their condition. Or even if you maybe ask for patient information, that could be like a very easy and simple use case where using a digital human could be very beneficial. Maybe you could have even like tablets in your hospital, or in your doctor's office, where people just interact with this digital human to provide their basic patient information. And I think that's one big use case. And then I think the second one is also in the customer context, providing product information. I think that's a big one, because
Yep.
that's
Mhm.
where we really where human experience can make a difference. And maybe having, for instance, like a digital human on your web page, explaining about certain product features could be something that gives. I think that could be something that gives great value to customers. So for me, it should have this emotional um, um, characteristic. The task should be worthy, or the interaction should be worthy to the customer. You wouldn't, because I mean, that seems to me like the first use cases where people benefit from this kind of emotional um, um, connection. And then I'm actually now wanting to add a third one. And I think the third one is actually teaching, because there were some studies that have shown that actually if we get better grasp the information, and I could see also there a big use case that in that I mean the time of teachers and professors is very limited, and actually if we somehow create digital humans that students can interact with, I think that could be a third very relevant use case for digital humans.
Wow. I mean, I think these are great examples, and they're quite spread out across the different industries, I guess, if you will. So I think this health piece is super interesting, and I've been in conversations with different organizations specifically around this, and there's a lot of excitement. Speaking with a professor just today, who highlights that some of the biggest issues they have are about some of the smallest things. What steals the valuable time of a doctor. It's not that the patient says, "Oh, I've got a major pain here. Can you help me?"
Mm-hmm.
No, that's what the doctor wants to do. That's what they're there for. It's when they say, "Oh, I think I've forgotten my appointment. When could you tell me when the appointment is again?" Or, "Oh, the drugs run out. Can you give me my next what do you call that? Um, uh, prescription for my medication."
Yeah.
So these are just a couple of things that this is critical for us because it wastes so much time. Should be fully automated.
And I
And
think
there was a great document by McKinsey about 2 years ago, where they were looking at the future of medicine, and they looked at the amount of money that was being spent in these different areas of digitalization. And what they found is, lots of money being spent, high value, is everything around AI to analyze data, AI to better understand, whether someone has a certain kind of cancer based on visual data and so on. And data management systems for health, and all of this, a huge investment, huge value. And then the one that they put as being also really important, but not a lot of money and focus on at the moment, was interacting with the human. Exactly the space that we're at. That's the biggest gap, I think, is, we're using a lot of AI, we're using a lot of digital to improve medicine, but not to improve the health system for the patient directly. All indirectly, of course, but not directly. And I think, as you're putting, digital humans have this opportunity to directly impact the benefits to the patient. And another point that was made today from this professor, they did some analysis on some of these digital medical records. And what they found was, it wasn't just putting the data in. That actually didn't make the patient feel any better. But if the doctor would then say, "Oh, by the way, I see that you've had X, Y, and Z, and therefore you must have had this situation, etc. And we've got an eye on that because you have been using, and entering data, let's say, into some kind of a digital medical system," that the patients had a huge improvement in terms of their perspective on whether the doctor was doing a good job or not. Patient satisfaction grew incredibly, not by having the app, but by the doctor then showing that they're actually looking at the data from the app and then reflecting it in their work. So, once again, it's not that the digital human will replace the doctor, but it certainly empowers the doctor and the patient in this case.
I think that's very critical. I think we need to somehow move from a automation story to an augmentation story where we can actually,
Yep.
the humans can perform skills better when they actually work with machines. And especially, I think in the healthcare context, I think it's an important narrative to push
Yep.
because I mean, in Japan, we actually see that people start that we see robots, for instance, in care situations, right? And they provide real value. And I think to reap these benefits, we need to push augmentation narratives rather than automation narratives, because I think people are a bit afraid of these automation narratives that they will not, that they somehow only the rich people will be able to interact with humans, and every other person will be subject to machines. And I think that's obviously not a nice story. But if we can start to tell these beneficial stories where actually you get now a very nice digital experience on top of talking to a human, on top of interacting also with humans, then I think it becomes a completely different narrative. And I think we can show that yes, there are, and I mean, if we look at the value of self-service, I mean, people became used to it and also saw that actually doing self-service can be very beneficial for myself. And then now actually pushing the narrative, we make self-service even better for you using these machines. And then we actually feed it also into a holistic user experience where we carefully think, what does a human do? What does a machine do? And how we can actually create seamless handovers between these two entities. I think then it becomes very, very clear that the benefits for humans are going to be vast, and in turn also for the firms that start to think about these kind of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. And if we take a wider societal view, and we try and step away from one of the weaknesses that I think have in society, which is, always to expect that everything is perfect. The reality is a lot of people are not getting any support, either by choice because, they're too embarrassed,
True.
or feel uncomfortable. I think I read a statistic today that about, I think just under or just over half of people, I think this was a US study, that had mental health issues don't seek support for that.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of that's to do with not wanting to admit that you have a problem in the first place or to take the steps to try and solve it. Having a digital human obviously takes away a lot of that human personal risk that people would attribute to that. And there's already a lot of studies that show that people share more information with a digital human than they do with a real human. So
Yeah.
there's the point that whatever fears that people have about data security with a digital human, they can be lower than the fears that people have that are stopping them want to speak to a real human. And that's quite dramatic if you think of it in many ways. And from a societal perspective, taking that nirvana fallacy away, there are lots of people not getting any help. And I think you mentioned education. I've been in a couple different conversations recently, one with a professor in mathematics, so gift and talent education, where he focuses on supporting talented people who don't have access to good education. And he's been doing this around the world. And a second study, which basically come around to the same thing. We have lots of people that are not getting any help at all. Or not getting enough help. how could you take something, let's say, like the Khan Academy, which is really there to try and
Yes.
enable a base level of learning for people around the world, and enhance that so that they get a real teacher-like interaction,
Mm-hmm.
even a classroom-like interaction with other kids potentially, without the need for a costly teacher, and it can be basically self-service. In many situations, you could imagine that being at least as good as what they're getting or better. And it may not be for everything, but it might be for lots of things. I sponsor a kid in Nepal who's gone through the whole education system. And when I was last there, we went and visited. And you see these kids and they're reciting something. It sounds like they're singing in another language. And it's only when I looked at the board, I realized they were actually saying English words. But neither the teacher nor the students actually understood what those words were or how to say them. So they're learning, they're rote learning English in a fun, in a fun way with all the other kids, etc. But there was sort of no link between what they were learning and the actual real language. And I think this is, these types of cases, I think a digital human, if they have access to that, could be a much better way of learning.
I definitely agree. And I think, I think that somehow comes also back to my initial statement that I think what digital humans and maybe even conversational interfaces can really do is they can improve existing kind of services by far. And I really like what you also said, and by that also give access to really good experiences to people that did not have access to that before. And I think that is a really nice narrative, and I think it's also a strong narrative. And then on also adding on this, I think you brought up a very good fourth kind of use case that would be really interesting to explore, which is providing psychological services to people. I think this is a very, very relevant topic right now because a lot of people don't have access to psychological services. And I think maybe digital humans could be the first line of intervention where people can actually start exploring some of the topics that bother them. And you're very right. There are these studies that show that people are feeling much more comfortable to share certain information with a digital human rather than with a human person itself. So it could actually maybe be a first kind of responder that helps you to really open up and to identify these topics that are relevant to you. And could even be like a diary, right? Like a diary like a more interactive form of diary that you tell your experiences and your challenges, and that might help you to reflect some of these experiences by asking relevant questions. So I think that could be actually a very, very interesting use case.
And reflecting back on things you've said in the past.
Yes. Yes. And also maybe just also, and then also thinking about, I think we're maybe in a kind of a brainstorming kind of session, but I mean also like just thinking also this act of maybe practicing conversation, like having like, I think we were actually in our research, we were talking to a coach and we were exploring the question whether we could actually use digital humans as some way of maybe you have like a job interview coming up and you want to practice how you talk, like how you respond to certain questions. Or I mean, this was my first podcast with you, so maybe it would have been nice to actually practice beforehand, having like a digital Stefan asking me
a better looking and more intelligent version of me asking you good questions.
Me already
that would be helpful.
certain questions, and I can practice like responding to this. This could also be an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we actually just came out is the podcast I did with Evelyn Palmer, who's a headhunter and has been doing that for more than a decade, and we're talking specifically about firstly how you could use you could have a digital interviewer
Yes.
as a core solution, but then you could turn that around, and rather than using that to actually interview people, you could apply some additional analytics to that, and you could reflect that back as an interview trainer model.
Yes.
Or you could turn it around and you could do it for interview training, so training someone how to be an interviewer, where the digital human, instead of being the interviewer, could actually be the interviewee, and responding in certain ways, and trying to test how you can best overcome challenges as an interviewer as well.
Yeah, and I think just reflecting us on this, I think the next step is really, and I think that's something what we wanted to do also in our research, is to find this really those use cases where like interacting with the power of the face. I like how you put it. The power of the face is really, really a benefit, because I think with all of these kind of experiences, what I've been seeing is that, especially in the initial phases, you need to find a good and strong use case based on which you can build. And you find, and I think and I think our or I think the key aim now will be for organization now to carefully think about what are these use cases where a digital human could be very, very beneficial. Then finding the second or third or fourth use case will be easy. You have the technology already and you can build on that. But I think, especially for the beginning, we need to always find the strong and easy, and where it's very obvious what the benefit of using this interface is. And I think that also needs to be, we also need to be a little bit bold. Also, I know from organizations that not somehow, for instance, I know one organization that started to use a chatbot for a certain kind of customer interaction. And now what they said is people can only interact with the chatbot, and they closed the email channel, for instance. And I think we need to also, so we need to start and small, but we also need to trust in it, and we need to be sure that actually adding this new customer channel can create value, and we should trust in this by actually maybe reducing the number of channels for a certain use case.
And or creating new channels as well. So I've got one example. So I'm working with a great speech trainer. So he works with, his name's Barry Kuntz. He works with, and has done for, I think, 30 years, worked with executives from all kinds of global corporates and training them how to be better speakers, teaching them how to respond to difficult questions, how to manage all kinds of situations. And now, he would like to do more with what he can. He'd like to expand his reach. He would like to not just work with, those corporates, those corporate giants that can afford to have his services, but really do something to give back, and also to broaden his connection, with his work and his legacy, really. And he's taken methodologies he's learned over the years. He's created his own very special blend that is incredible. It's a super powerful set of tools that are pragmatic and simple. And now he's building this into a digital human as a first step, so that people who want to just, let's say, get some light touch support, have some personal challenges, would like to learn some tips on how to do that, don't have the time to read his book, which he's also written, they can now go to his digital human. Well, not now. We're still in the development process, and reach in there and pull out the gems of wisdom that he's spent the last 30 years generating and communicating it in a way that people can actually get it. And it's a picture of him. It's him speaking. So as they learn about him, they can also then, if they need to, or if they would like to expand it, maybe bring him on for a training, this becomes then an additional channel. They can still bring him on and do corporate trainings or get personalized support. And if they do that, it's not going to be new. They already know him because they've been speaking to him digitally this whole time on his website or on his other channels.
Yeah, this is very, very, very exciting, and I think it's also exciting that you would even say that it's interesting that like a speech trainer is like one of the first innovators in this kind of space, and I think there is probably a lot of competitive advantage
Yeah.
to gain from these kinds of experiences. And I think, and somehow I felt you in the beginning you were asking me the question, what is exciting about conversational interface or digital humans, and I didn't answer it straight away. I feel, and I think that maybe sums also up a little bit what we've been talking about, is that somehow language has become like this has become the new screen, the new way we interact with technology, and this new kind of human computer interaction. We talk to human-like or humanized computer interfaces, and people will expect this. And I think this is very famous. I'm not sure about the number I'm saying now, but it's a pretty high number. I think it's around 70% of millennials that rather go to the dentist than to the bank branch, to the next retail bank branch. I'm not sure. I think it's around 70%, and I think if we look at banking pages, web pages, home pages, it becomes very, very clear they're boring. Well, like there's chatting or like having like this human element is the least what we see on these pages. But now using these kinds of technology, like a digital human or like a conversational interface, greeting somebody at the beginning, could be something that could be so instrumental to really transforming your customer experience. And I think there are companies that really, we have a lot of these examples now, like in the digital, we were just exploring some of these examples, but also just staying at the finance sector. For instance, there's like this app Salma that helps you to go through investment decisions, and I think we will now see a lot of these examples pop up. And I'm also very confident that we will also see now more and more experiences being brought by digital humans. And I see that's especially those companies that now start to think about these experiences really starting to maybe gain traction.
Well, on those powerful notes, the exciting elements of the new interface that we have to all of our technology. I'd like to ask you all, please, if you enjoyed today, share a comment, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Great to get the message out there. Huge thank you to Naim. Always fantastic discussions. I love the depth and breadth that you've gone into in the space. And wishing you all a wonderful continuation of the week, and looking forward to see you again here next week, where we'll have once again a new episode of Real Digital Humans. All right. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Bye.
This was the Real Digital Humans podcast. Please like, follow or subscribe to hear more.